Well, welcome again. This is Paul Gronke from the Early Voting Information Center at Reed College. I'm here with my friend and colleague, Mike Alvarez from the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project. And our guest today is Lonna Atkeson from the University of New Mexico. We've all been friends and colleagues for many years, but Lonna is here to speak to some of her research and continue the Resilient Election Series. So today I'm going to hand it off to Mike. Mike, how you doing down there?
I am doing really well. It's the weather's turned nice down here in Southern California, so we have no complaints. I just wanted to, introduce quickly our colleague, Lonna Atkeson, professor at the University of New Mexico. I'll let her, do a quick introduction to her in a second before we get started. I've known her for a long time. I've worked a lot with Lonna. In fact, I just wanted to show this massive tome that Lonna and I co-edited. It's the Oxford Handbook on Polling and Survey Methods. And Lonna has got a great deal of expertise, both in terms of survey methodology, but also working directly with election officials to build various types of survey tools that we can, and that we and they can use to improve election administration. So that's what we're going to try to talk about today. So over to you, Lonna. A quick introduction, and please introduce yourself to the folks who are watching the show.
I'm Lonna Atkeson. I'm a professor at the University of New Mexico. I direct the Center for the Study of Voting, Elections, and Democracy, and I'm the executive director of the Institute for Social Research, all of these applied social research shops. My focus has been on election administration and election science and election policy, but I've been branching out into transportation policy recently, but that's a different aside. We're here to talk about the elections and what's coming up this year and for this election, which is very uncertain at the moment.
Right. And, I think what's interesting is I think we're all finding that we're these days branching out into various unknown territories and different topics. And so, it'd be interesting to hear more about the transportation work. But so you were one of the pioneers in actually building surveys and survey questions and survey instruments to give voters an opportunity to talk about their experiences when they went to vote, about the confidence they have with the process, and to also assess their attitudes and opinions about various aspects of the electoral process. How do you think that the surveys that you've been doing, and this goes back to at least 2006, 2004, when you first started working on these, how do you think that the work you've done helps election officials and election administrators improve the work that they do?
It helps directly, and we've been doing this since the election administration component of these since 2006. And so we have data, so we have our own sort of New Mexico election study that is every federal election, 2006, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, and 18. So we have 7 years of our own election studies in New Mexico, which is pretty impressive. I think that they do a very good job of helping the election administrators. They certainly have in New Mexico. They provide really concrete information and feedback about the effectiveness of their programs, about where their programs are having problems, and also where they have successes, right? When things are working, so it works both ways. It provides a lot of information along with poll worker surveys, voter surveys, and election day observations. You can get a very good look at the election ecosystem, something that election officials can't do themselves because they're very busy, especially on election day, but also before election day and just after. And so they provide a lot of good feedback, which is then integrated into their program to improve the process next time.
So Lonna, so sometimes when we do these kind of projects, you're doing a survey, for example, of voter confidence and voter experiences in New Mexico across many of the counties, and you are supposed to deliver back a report to the election officials. Sometimes we find things that they don't like and they don't necessarily want to hear. Sometimes the feedback isn't positive. Sometimes it's negative. How do you deal with that? I mean, how do you handle providing feedback that may not be what some of the election officials want to hear?
So, because this is a long-term process and you're doing it iteratively, you really gain an advantage in terms of talking about your results and how you're improving the system. So the process actually provides cover for election officials, because when something goes wrong, which always happens, not every election, but something always goes wrong at some point, you have an ability to say, you know what, we have an independent group actually looking at this, and we're going to be looking at their advice and what they say and be talking about this in the future. And we've actually seen that happen here in New Mexico several times. So, one of the things that's really difficult, I think, about working with elected officials is, they have to get elected every so often, sometimes every other year, sometimes every 4 years, but they have to get elected very often. And so, the harm that you could potentially do to them is very big. So, creating a working relationship and an understanding that this is a benefit for the constituents, ultimately for the citizens, and for the election official, because it provides, real opportunities for them to say they're doing something and ways to solve their problems when they happen.
So kind of on that same theme, sometimes you do have to provide back, feedback to election officials. It may not be what they want to hear. Another issue that, as academics, that when we're doing research in this area in particular, it's a highly polarized area. It's very political these days, is trying to maintain neutrality and trying to not, be partisan in the work that we do. How do you toe that line? I mean, how do you kind of work in a state like New Mexico that, is pretty divided politically, and try to maintain that neutral and nonpartisan focus? I know it's hard, but what have you done, and what kind of advice do you have for other academics?
I think that's really hard because, you have a party ID and it's in the voter file and people know it. And, I think that's very complicated, and, relationships around politics are built on trust. And I really think that it comes from a long-term game, a long-term strategy that you're thinking of when you're looking at this and trying to convince election officials that you're not there to do a gotcha, that your commitment is about improving the election system, that their commitment is about improving the election system. And so those common and shared goals help to drive that relationship and build that trust. It's really important because I've seen other academics fail at this, in part, I believe, because they do look at this as a gotcha, or, oh, look, I found this problem. And it's really, not about a particular problem, or look what you're doing wrong. It's not a gotcha moment. It's about, building and improving the election system. And, when you structure the discussion around that, it enables those problems to be, reduced.
Yeah, and I think you've hit upon something really important here for us as academics when we think about trying to work with election officials and elected officials, and that is building a relationship that's based on trust. And that is very hard to do. And I know that, like, you and I and Paul as well, we've been working in this area for decades, right? And so, when you're working in the field for that length of time, you can kind of start to establish a little bit of trust with some election officials. But let's say you're a new scholar. You're someone who's just gotten a tenure track job at a university out here in the West somewhere, and you want to approach your local county election official. You want to do a project with them. You want to study vote centers or voting by mail. What kind of practical steps would you take if you were that academic? What advice would you give them in terms of how to start building that relationship with that elected official, say, in their county?
Well, obviously, contacting them, trying to set up an initial meeting with them, talking about, what projects you've done before, how your work can really help them. A lot of this has to do with the personality, actually, as well, of the election administrator. Some election administrators, they just don't want to bother with you at all. Some people, they've got their agenda and you're not part of it. But then other people are very interested in improving the process. They're, bureaucratically oriented. They care about what they're doing a lot. and they're focused and interested on that. So getting them interested in what you can accomplish, what kind of skills you bring to the table that are going to enable them to improve the process and improve, their stature within that process, right? That's going to have a positive impact on them, is really the initial steps to go.
So Lonna, one of the things that you first started working on when you were doing some of the early voter surveys, the paper that you published was in 2006, I think, right? Was the first paper. Mm-hmm. Focused on voter confidence, and voter confidence is obviously a really important concept in the field. And the three of us actually have had our disagreements, right, over how to measure it in surveys and over its importance and its utility. So can you just talk a little bit about, how back, what is it, 2004, 2005, 2006, you and Kyle started thinking about measuring confidence, how you set us down this path, because I think the measure that the process and set of questions that you all developed are the ones that most people use these days. What's the background of that, and what are the best practices that you think now exist for trying to measure this important concept of voter confidence?
Okay, so voter confidence is really important. It's a different measure than political trust because it really is focusing on the process of voting. And the confidence question at the individual level specifically asks, how confident are you that your ballot was counted as intended? And we see that as sort of the primary measure of whether or not people think the process is good for them, right? Does it work for them? They may hear other things about other counties and other states and other areas, but, is their ballot counted correctly? And so we've been using this measure since 2005, 2006. I think the first person who started that measure, actually, Mike, was either you or Chuck Bullock. And so those are the first two papers that I saw that measure in use. And then we added it in 2006, I think, because of a conversation I had actually with you. And then I added, because of my work in federalism, my early work in federalism, we added particular questions about then how they felt about the state, and then how they felt about their county, and how they felt about the nation. In that 2006 survey, we asked about all of those areas. So that's how we sort of, gain the larger perspective on voter confidence, looking at the different geographical components of election administrations, counties, precincts, states, and the nation.
Yeah, and some of the advantages here, Lonna, for administrators and other scholars is that we have a lot of measures of this in a lot of different locations, different states, county levels, and national. So you can gauge how your state, how your county is doing if you get a measure on this. And we also have information over time. So some areas have improved. Unfortunately, I think we all know that both at the individual level and at the county and certainly national level, there's been some erosion. That some of what we're hearing nationally, battles over the voting wars, have really not helped. And they've eroded confidence even as election systems locally have improved, right? We all know that technology's improved, but yet there's still some erosion. So yeah, it's nice to have this kind of measure we can look at over time.
It is, and it's really important to have it at a state level. So thinking about jurisdictions and, creating their own survey data over time, it's really important to have jurisdictional data on this, because the national picture is so different. Election administration is really delivered at a local level. And so looking at this on a national level doesn't really represent sort of what's going on in your jurisdiction in particular. So for example, one difference we really see between state and local studies and national studies is a difference between whites and Hispanics and Blacks in their voter confidence. But when we look within jurisdictions and within states, we find that usually goes away. So there's a very interesting finding. There's a really good reason why we need jurisdictional studies, why we need them over time, because you need the feedback from your jurisdiction. Election administration is such a federal, so federally approached. Every jurisdiction has slight variations within them.
Speaking of jurisdictions, obviously another important group to think about surveying are those people who, the street level bureaucrats, those people who are working in the polling places and the vote centers. You've also been doing surveys of poll workers, vote center workers for quite some time. Similar to kind of the earlier question about how you go about surveying voters, how do you go about surveying poll workers, and what kinds of questions do you think are really important to ask them, from the lens of, like, let's just pretend that we're an election official and an academic somewhere, and we want to ask some questions, non-COVID. I mean, obviously there'll be COVID-related questions this fall, but what are the important things that you might want to put into a poll worker survey, say in November 2020?
So we've been modifying our poll worker surveys over that same amount of time. And so one of the things we transitioned to is we do 2 surveys for poll workers at this point in time. One during the training process to evaluate their training right after it happens, before the election, and then a post-election assessment of their election experiences. So we've separated those out so they're not having to remember their training while they're also remembering what happened election day. So I would say those 2 large topics are perhaps the most important topics. And then I'd say there's some more minor topics about, how do you recruit people? How did they find out about being a poll worker? What were they happy with? Why did they do it? Those kinds of other things are beneficial in thinking about, where and how you go about recruiting poll workers, which is a critical thing for local election officials.
And Lonna, if scholars or administrators wanted to get an idea about the things you ask, I assume they can contact you and might share some of the instruments so we can get some countermeasures. Absolutely.
Absolutely. All of the reports that we have are online, and you can just download all of our reports, all of our instruments, and all of our frequency reports. Everything is available online.
One last question, Lonna. And again, it's one of these things that I think we as academics, I know Paul's done this, I've done this, and you do this. We don't just do research. Obviously, we teach, we train graduate students, we mentor them. And one of the things that I've been, amazingly, just impressed about with respect to your career has been the phenomenal efforts that you've done to bring students into this area of work. I've worked with you on some of these projects in New Mexico, met many of these students, undergraduates and graduate students, and I know that many of them have continued, right, in their careers, either in the private sector, the public sector, or in academics, to study, election administration and voting technology. Can you just talk a little bit about, how do you go about finding students to work on these projects? How do you incentivize them to help? And just, if you have any thoughts about what some of your colleagues could do to better involve our students in these efforts, I think that would be really great advice.
So I've really integrated election observations as part of a classroom experience, both for my Intro to American Government class and my political behavior and elections classes and research design classes. There's another place where you can implement them well. And so all of the undergraduates and all of my graduate students, spend the day observing the elections. Sometimes we pay them, sometimes I just give them credit. And it's always a great experience for them. I mean, it's one thing to go into a polling place and vote, and it's a whole different thing to go into a polling place and watch. And they all experience it like that. They come back and go, wow, I really didn't know voting was that complex, or, and it's not like it's exciting stuff watching that. It's not Adventure City, but it is interesting. And, it teaches you about the process, and, that it's actually a much more complex process than simply counting votes. So I think it has lots of benefits. I think some people get interested in the subject. And I had an undergraduate move to DC and get a job with the Bipartisan Policy Coalition. And then I've also had many students, of course, work on this, do theses on this, honors theses, dissertations. So I think it's, giving them opportunities to see that. I think that people like the applied side of political science when they start doing it. It's a different feeling to be actually engaging with other people and improving the process, and using that data to also, inform theories and in political science, right? So connecting sort of the applied side and the theory side is really fun for everyone.
Well, Mike, it can be exciting when someone locks the door and leaves the engine running when you're doing election observation in Los Angeles. Not that that might have ever happened to anyone here. No, I'm glad you asked that question, and Lonna, that was a wonderful response. This has been a challenge. Lonna, I know you and Mike, I'm going to miss the count here, but you have co-authored together 3, 4 books, a number of articles. And so I think part of it is a demonstration effort on our part that there is some academic rewards to doing this work. There also, as you say, there is the rewards of seeing democracy in action and really helping it improve. That's what my undergrads at Reed College, I know, have really benefited from and find it very rewarding. I know Mike's students as well at Caltech, and Lonna, I know many of your students as well. So it's been a challenge for us since 2000, but I think we've gotten over the hump, and the discipline recognizes the value of this work, as do administrators.
And,
so listen,
and voters.
Absolutely. So I want to thank,
that's really, yeah.
I don't think voters are reading our political science journals, but I'd like to think that.
But I've been in, so this is like my all-time favorite story. It was so long ago, but I was in the precincts, I think it was in 2010 or 2000, and that was in 2008, and we had just done our big audit study with Pew, where we redid the whole 2006 election to figure out what our audit rules would be and whether the machines were working well. And so we got a lot of press on that, and I was in the precincts watching voting on election day, and a voter actually came up to me and said how much he appreciated what we did, and that he actually trusted the machines more than he used to because of the work that we had done.
That's really a wonderful story, and thank you. So I want to thank Lonna Atkeson of the University of Mexico for joining us. Hope everyone is staying safe, and we are going to continue to provide some video series here to try to understand how we can help promote resilient elections as we move toward this very complicated event in 2020. So thank you all. Thanks, Mike. Thank Lonna, and we'll see you on the other side.